Well, welcome to Homeward. I'm Jim Burns. I want to ask you a question today. Are you ever lonely? There are times that I have been lonely in the midst of a crowd. There are times when I've been lonely in the midst of my wonderful family. In college, one of my mentors, he was a professor, he said to me, leaders can often be lonely. And I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I do now. See, and today we are so fortunate to have Ruth Graham with us. She is a person who also has known loneliness, and she's written a great book on the subject. It's called Transforming Loneliness. I told her before the podcast that I just read the book and I loved the book. I told my wife after the first time I interviewed Ruth that she was one of the most authentic people I'd ever met, and that if she was our neighbor, I would want her to be our best friends. No pressure. But anyway, she is from Virginia and we're in California, so we're not neighbors. But anyway, it can be a little bit intimidating to meet someone from kind of what you'd call a famous family. I mean, I became a Christian when I was 16 years old, wasn't raised in the church, had no understanding. And I heard about somebody named Billy Graham and then his wife, Ruth Graham. I know they have a mom and a daughter, same name thing. And that was transformative to me. And then I meet Ruth, and transparent is the word most people use to describe Ruth Graham. She's the founder and president of Ruth Graham Ministries. She is the author of multiple books. And you know what? One of my favorite books is a 20-year-old book. It's called In Every Pew Sits a Broken Heart. And it helped me understand that at every church, in every time, and every person, we're at the store, wherever, there's some broken hearts with some really difficult challenges. And I learned that from that book, and I really appreciate it. She lives in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Ruth has 3 adult children and 9 grandchildren. Ruth, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, Jim, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Well, this is great. And I told you before, your accent to a Southern California guy is great. And you said you don't even think you have an accent. So I think more of our podcast listeners probably don't think you have an accent, but I do. And I think it's wonderful. I was sitting with a friend of mine the other day, and I told him that I was going to be talking with you about loneliness, and his eyes welled up with tears. And he kind of blurted out, well, I'm lonely. And I didn't see that coming. Successful at work, active in his church, appears to be happily married, kids all around him, people all around him. But you say that's not that uncommon. Is that right?
It really isn't. I think it's like 54% of-
Wow.
will say that they are lonely. And
Yeah.
it's really sort of a tragedy that so many feel lonely and um, don't know what to do about it. They just sort of sit in their loneliness. And of course, if loneliness is, if it persists, then it can lead to all sorts of problems. It can lead to health issues. It can
Yeah.
eventually leading to suicide. But we don't
Yeah.
want it to get that far. That's why we have this book. So we want to give people tools to work with to get out of their loneliness.
Yeah, well, that's why I appreciated the book, actually, Transforming Loneliness, because you talked about how bad it was, but then you just didn't leave us hanging. You identified with us. You actually showed empathy because of even some past experiences in your life. And then you said, and here's some things you can do. So, I mean, that's where I want to go with this today. But first, I want to quote you from the book. You said, a sad longing crept over me. I was alone. I was used to being alone as a single person, but now I was lonely. Respond to that.
I've been alone most of my adult life. I'm
Mhm.
not married. I have a wonderful little cat that keeps me company. But I think that there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Lonely is the feeling that loneliness can absolutely consume you. And we cannot let it go unchecked. We have to be able to number one, express it to
Mhm.
someone, to God first, and then to one other trusted person. And I had a young woman come into my office not long ago, and she sat down. She said, "I'm lonely," and I was so glad that she did because then we could address it. But if we
Right.
pretend that we're not, and we're so good at pretending, especially in the church, that's
Sure we
why
are.
I wrote "In Every Pew Sits a Broken Heart."
Yeah, right.
We have these masks and we shouldn't wear these masks. We need to be honest and open and say, I am lonely. Loneliness doesn't have to go on and on. It can be a period, just a short period in your life, but it feels overwhelming, but you're not going to be there forever.
Right, right. And you said something in your book. You said that alone can either be positive
Mhm.
or negative.
Mhm.
And so alone, if you're alone, that doesn't mean it's negative. It can also be positive. What are the two sides to that? Talk about the negative, which you've already kind of mentioned, but talk also about the positive side to being alone.
Well, the positive side is that I think I make a contrast between uh, being alone and being isolated and being, um, anyway, there's another word for it. But
Well, isolated. I mean, isolated. I think a lot of people
isolated,
who are lonely
it's not,
do feel isolated, and you can feel isolated even in the midst of being around people.
well, and isolation is not healthy. The Bible
Right.
says that he who separates himself is not wise. And
Yeah.
God puts us in with people. He wants us to be with
Right.
people. But I think that if you are like solitude, where
Yeah.
you can refresh yourself, you can talk with God, you can hear from God, you can,
Yeah.
it's a regenerative kind of thing if we're when
Sure.
we're in solitude. David, look at him. He spent all that time alone and look at what he
Right.
did. He wrote
Right.
all those hymns that we sing and
Yeah.
read about in the scriptures every morning. And then he also trained with his
Right.
slingshot. Over and
Right.
over again, he was prepared when the giant showed up. So solitude can be very beneficial.
Right, right. And that's so positive, and that's actually one of the things that you said toward the end of the book where you talked about, how we do need solitude. This morning I got up super early and I opened up my Bible. I do this every day. In 1983 I made a commitment to read through the Bible every year. My wife thinks this is the most boring thing, not the Bible, but that I do the same. I've done the same thing since '83.
Good
I,
for
I
you.
read the 1 year Bible, I read a devotional, and then I write in my journal acts, which I taught when I was a youth pastor
Mm,
to kids: adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication. And I even put, our producer, Mike Segovia, put his name in it today. I put yours in terms of my thankful part
uh,
because the acts, adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication. And, but the interesting side is I treasure those
mm,
moments. And yet I'm an extrovert. So I get energized if I'm at the party. My wife's an introvert. She'll have a significant conversation with one person sitting on the couch, and she won't meet everybody. That used to bother me, but 50 years later, you kind of let that go. And then I will have a shallow conversation with everybody. See, and and that energizes me.
mm,
But that solitude for me, when you described alone in a positive way, I went, "Oh my gosh, that's where I get my strength every day."
mhm.
And people don't see that, people don't know that necessarily about me, but I think that's an important, the discipline
Yeah,
of solitude is a terrific
yeah.
thing. Now, when you're talking about alone on the negative side, you've experienced singleness, and you said right now, I mean, you're single. Do you think singles have a harder time with, loneliness than couples, or, is that even an issue?
I think it's across the board. I
Mhm.
think
Yeah.
we all experience loneliness, and yet we run away from it. But I
Mhm.
think it's loneliness in a group, when you're in a crowd. Loneliness in
Yeah.
a marriage is horrible. I've
Sure.
experienced that over and over again, terrible
Yeah.
experiences. So
Sure.
you can be very lonely while you're
Yeah.
with people. And I
Right.
think when we're experiencing that, it seems to intensify the loneliness because we think we shouldn't be lonely. We've got people around us,
Yeah.
but we are lonely.
No, no, and you're right. I mean, and we all experience loneliness, and I love that that woman came into your office and said, "I'm lonely," because this was loneliness is not necessarily a sin at all, but the Bible says when you confess your sins, you will be to somebody, you'll be healed.
Mhm, mm,
So in confessing what we're doing, whether it be this a sin or whether it be something like loneliness, it's important because that gives freedom. I've found that if I will say to somebody, "Wow, I've just really been feeling down," or "I've been feeling lonely," or I feel a little anxiety," people don't say, "Well, you are a Christian. You need to pull it together." What I hear is, "Wow, can I pray for you? I've been there. I am there." It's interesting, and I just want to challenge our listeners, and actually also on the Homeward YouTube channel. You know, tell people if you're struggling with this. Now, what's fascinating is you did a little study, and you reported this study in your book. You kind of looked at people from who were born before 1944 all the way to Gen Z, and you commented that the Gen Z crowd is the most lonely. That percentage-wise, they're the most
that's
lonely.
right. That's
Did that surprise you, or was that no, yeah, that made sense to you?
well, because of all our digital communication and our social
Yeah.
media.
Mm.
And I asked my grandson, because he's a Gen Z, and I said, he's 27. I said, "Are you lonely?" is your generation, you find this to be true? He said,
Yeah.
absolutely. He said, we
Yeah.
are the loneliest people because we have lots of connections, but we don't have any real connections.
Yeah.
And he said, it's scary.
Yeah, I'm seeing that too. And after I read your book the other day, I just went online and I was blown away by the amount of information on how lonely Gen Z is. And it's interesting because your grandson is at the kind of the edge
Yeah.
toward being a millennial,
Mhm.
but they're at an age where they're starting to get married. The average marriage right now in America is for a woman 29, 31 for a guy. So it's getting older, but they're going to get married and they're going to be lonely they're going to bring their loneliness and some of their lack of connection. And that actually is something that we don't think about much. You said what's driving this. You talked about what's driving this loneliness, and you mentioned four critical areas. And I want to mention them to you. And I'd like you don't have to comment on every one in detail, but just I'd love for you to comment. You said geographical mobility, technology,
Mhm.
obviously, a decrease in common cultural connections, which I thought was interesting, and a decline in religious affiliation.
Mhm. And I
Speak to
think
that.
that probably is key. The biggest factor is that we don't have, of course, churches bring people together. That's community.
Mhm.
But that also that we don't have that common worship of the Lord and
Right,
understanding of why we're
right,
here and what we're here for. If
right.
we're just sort of floating out there and we have no clue, I just, it's very lonely. I feel like,
Yeah,
out in space somewhere without
right,
being tethered. And we, that's a terrible place to be.
right, right. It's funny when you say Gen Z, when you think about Gen Z, I just read that George Barna says in his latest research that there is a much stronger sense of atheism within Gen Z.
Mm,
So they've lost the connection to the church. And as I'm looking at that, and I'm actually doing some thinking about writing on this subject next for me, what I'm seeing is when they come back to the church, a lot of times it's not, oh, the pastor is wonderful, or even the worship is great. They're saying, I'm coming back for community.
mm.
I had community because I was in the church and then I left the church and I really miss community. And isn't that interesting that it goes along with this idea of loneliness?
Mhm. Absolutely. I just think we have to be connected,
Yeah.
to God and other people.
Yeah, right. And yet at the same time, in this world, they live by technology. My daughter, who she's 34, but she was telling me this weekend she was over at our house and she was saying, she says, "Oh, I asked her what happened to her friend. The friend lives in New York, and she goes, "Oh, I talk to her every day, Dad." And I go, "You do?" And of course, I'm thinking she gets on the phone and I started to go like this. My daughter wouldn't know how to dial a phone.
No.
She pushes the button, she calls, and she goes, "No, Dad, it's DM. We're, we're messaging each other. We sometimes text each other." And I thought to myself, in her mind, she's connecting with someone that's not as good as when you're face to face.
No. You wanna see
Yeah,
eyeballs.
yeah, exactly. And when you're in that, and too many are like that. I mean, no doubt. So again, technology, is an issue. I want to take a quick break. I want to come back, and when we come back, I want to talk about just the positive sides. And I actually want to get more into the idea of solitude, but I also want to talk about the dark side of loneliness. And I thought you did such a great job communicating that in your book, Transforming Loneliness. By the way, Ruth Graham is with us today. In the podcast notes, on this podcast, you can get all things Ruth Graham. There's a connection to website. There's a connection to this book as well as her other books. And when we come back, we'll talk about chronic loneliness. And some people are lonely. Some people have a chronic loneliness. And not only that, can that make us miserable, but Ruth said it at the very beginning, it can also make us sick. But we also got to talk about what can we do for that and how can we help. If you're lonely today, then I want you to make sure you stick with us because we're going to talk about how you can, use your loneliness to transform your life. And actually, I think draw yourself closer to God. Many of my lonely times have caused me to lean into my relationship with the Lord. And there's not easy answers, and it's just not read John 3:16, but I think there are some answers. We're going to get to that. We'll be right back. Don't go away. I'm Jim Burns. You're listening to Homeward.
I'm Erin Mashaw, and I want to invite you into an honest conversation about one of life's most awkward yet important topics, sex.
Conversations about sex can bring up all kinds of weird emotions, not the least of which is awkward. But that's not a reason to avoid the topic altogether.
So, if everybody's doing it, then what's the big deal? where do you go with your questions? There are lots of voices telling you who you are, how to dress, what to think, how to feel. So how do we know what to listen to? Who can we trust to guide us?
When we treat others with radical respect, we honor God, we make our lives and relationships better, and we reflect God's love to the world all around us.
Now, I know you might be thinking, what? I don't need guardrails. I have good intentions, but what if intention isn't enough?
And as you think about the path from where you are now to where you want to be, who are the friends that can help you get there?
You'll hear personal stories, helpful advice, and truth from the Bible about how to make wise choices when it comes to love, sex, and dating.
Imagine being able to look back on this stage of your life without regrets about the way you handled relationships. You're not going to get there by accident. You're going to have to decide in advance what guardrails to put in place to get to where you want to be.
Join us for a student's guide to sexual integrity.
Welcome back. I'm Jim Burns. Today we're talking with Ruth Graham. What a privilege to have this woman on our podcast. And her book is called Transforming Loneliness. See, it's right here. And again, you can get all that information, as we just said, on the podcast notes. And you can also get the information on how to reach her and learn much more about her ministry. And by the way, when I've read her books, and I thought I had read every book, and then Transforming Loneliness popped up and I hadn't read it. But her books are so transparent, so authentic, and you just relate to her in such a great way. Well, you can tell we've been having this conversation. Ruth, before we get to the positive side, I do want to talk about the darker side to loneliness. And I think those are your words, not mine, but it just describes it. So there's a dark side to loneliness, and you wrote about it by you experienced it through a divorce. And a lot of people do experience loneliness when there is a divorce. What can a person do who has gone through a trauma in the family relationship, whether it be a divorce or it be a child who's strayed? I wrote a book called Doing Life with Your Adult Children, and oh my gosh, every day people write us about our kids were raised in the church and then they strayed, And when there's trauma or when there's really a problem, a bigger problem, what do you do when the dark side is just, ripping your heart apart?
Well, I really do think it's important to evaluate what the symptoms and the source of the loneliness. Why are you lonely? And is it
Yeah.
trauma? If it's a trauma, do you need to get a counselor? Do you
Right.
need to find someone to talk to about it? And I would say, yes, you do.
I do too.
But if you don't do anything about it, then as I said, it does lead to diseases. A chronic loneliness is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Amazing.
That's just amazing to me. And
Yeah.
we are seeing an epidemic of loneliness. The person who is alone isn't really alone because there's so many of us that experience it. And I experienced that one time, and I wrote about it in the book, that I was doing research for this book, and I took a book on the plane with me to read about loneliness. And I sat down and I started to pull it out of my bag, and I thought the loneliness was in the title. I said, he's going to think I'm lonely. So I put it back in the bag.
Right.
How
Yeah.
silly. But
Right.
we feel shamed when we feel alone, but there's no shame in it because there are so many of us, and it is an epidemic. And the Surgeon General has called it a national crisis, health crisis.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting that you brought up the word shame? Because I think sometimes we think something has happened in our life. And I always say, really good parents have kids who make poor choices, and, it's not all about us. And, and obviously things happen in our marriages and things like that, but we feel shame. We feel as much shame when we just are lonely. And yet loneliness is a common reaction in life.
But
I,
somehow we feel like loneliness means we're deficient somehow.
Yeah, right.
Like-
So if you're reading, and it makes sense. If you're reading a book on loneliness, I've written some books on sexuality, trying to help kids. So I always keep those books not on a plane. I keep those books far, far away because I'm thinking it's creepy. The person sitting next to me would go, who is this guy? And I'm going to stay away from him. It's kind of funny. So there's a dark side, obviously, and there are and you have gone through that, and you got to what would you say, practically speaking? You mentioned counseling, and the Bible says where there's no counsel, the people fall. In the multitude of counselors, there is safety. The smartest thing a person could do is try to get to those issues. But what were some of the practical things that you've done along in your life when you've experienced loneliness?
Well, in the book, I use an acronym REACH.
Exactly.
recognize and evaluate the source and symptoms of your loneliness.
Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
express it to one other trusted person. Express it to God. Tell God how you feel,
Mm.
and
Right.
don't hesitate to tell God how you feel. Just exactly how you feel, because He knows
Right.
it anyway. So just tell Him. Talk
Yeah.
to Him about it, and it helps you to talk it out. And then A is anticipate that God is going to transform your loneliness and that He will use it. But anticipate what God will do and connect with others. Connect
Yeah.
with others. And then H is honor God with your loneliness. How do
Yeah.
we honor God with our loneliness? By giving it to Him.
Yeah.
And I think one great antidote to loneliness is worship. I
Yeah.
have
I love.
experienced that for myself. I believe that Abraham experienced that as he walked up Mount Moriah. People think, oh, he was heavy hearted and but I think he was worshiping with every step because he was excited to see what God was going to do when he got to the top. He knew that God could raise Isaac from the dead. And so
Right.
he was worshiping. And I know
Yeah.
for me, one Christmas, my husband decided to go hunting on Christmas Day. And I argued with him all week, said, don't do this. This is
Yeah.
family time. Be with us. And he said, no, he was determined to go hunting. And
Yeah.
so I was just really angry with him.
Sure.
But I hope the kids weren't aware of it. They were busy playing with their toys. And once he left, I thought, now I've got the rest of the day to do. What am I going to do? So we played with the toys and I cleaned up the house and I cleaned up the meal um, and put the kids to bed. And I thought, now what do I do? I've got the evening. And I thought, well, I've received some nice Christmas gifts. I'll write thank you notes and get that off my list. And so I finished writing those and then said, now what do I do? Well, we had a piano in the living room and I can't find middle C, but I can plunk out a tune. And I plunked out the tune of Thou didst leave thy throne and thy kingly crown when thou camest to earth for me. And I
Mm.
just simply worshiped the Lord. And you know, Jim, that's the happiest Christmas memory I have.
Isn't that something? Yeah, that's something. You wrote about that experience, and I was mad many years later. I mean, just last week. But it's the antidote sometimes to loneliness. Yeah, it is all the things that you said in terms of talking to God about it. You actually honoring God is also sometimes just when you say, God, I'm not happy about this, but I'm lonely. Even admitting it, He can handle that.
Well, and you
But it's all and connecting with people. But sometimes it is that element of worship. It's not like we have to, the antidote is not always just be around people and, that. Sometimes it's just being with God and worshiping, because worship is such a special experience that brings us intimacy with God.
Well, and didn't David do that? He was alone
Exactly.
in the wilderness, and his
Yeah.
heart often turned to worship.
Yeah. So good. So somebody's sitting out there, maybe like what I started this podcast with, I never would have dreamed the guy I was having breakfast with, was lonely. What would you say to them today if they've heard this podcast and they go, I identify with everything that they're saying, and I need to at least take a step? What would you say practically that they could do?
Again, I think it is to take a look at it
Yeah.
and see what the source is,
Right.
and evaluate it.
Yeah.
And then, if I were sitting across the table from them, I'd grab their hand and tell them that they're not alone. That there's
Right.
so many people that
Yeah.
are lonely, and we need each other.
Right.
We need the
Right.
community. Again, it's just wonderful to have community.
Yeah. I can remember having an experience once where I don't think I'd even expressed it to a mentor in my life that I was feeling somewhat lonely or whatever, but I was telling him about some of the things that were going on. My mom had died, and I was very tied to my mom, and my mom had died, and my three brothers had gone through a divorce, all in the same 9 months, kind of the same issue. And it was just life was hard. At Homeward, we were having some trouble with finances, and it was just one of those things. And my friend, and it looked, two men doing this, but we were at a restaurant, an Olive Garden of all places, and he took my hand
Mhm.
and he said, Jim, the Bible is clear. God will never leave you or forsake you. And if you feel forsaken, it's okay.
Mm.
But no, and he said, you know what, Jim? I'm going to call you next week because I'm not going to leave you or forsake you either. And he was kind of, I just got chills thinking about it, because he was kind of God's
Mhm.
mouthpiece to me. And if he would have just said, here's what the Bible says, and I love the Bible, I love the Word of God, but I'm not sure it would have been as powerful as if he would have He held my hand.
It would have.
So here are two men holding hands many years ago now, at a restaurant, but that was beautiful. His touch, his sincerity. And I think we need to find people like that who can help us in those times of need. And if we're not willing to reach out, like you say, to God and to others, then we're sometimes going to get sick and my goodness, bad things can happen.
That's right. It's so important to express it to somebody else, but also to God, and we do. I think when we turn to Him and we tell Him that we're lonely, that honors
Yeah.
Him because we have turned to Him. He wants
Yes.
us to come to Him, and when we come, He's honored.
Yeah. No, that's so good. I can't believe our time is up, but that was such a great comment at the end, and we all need to remember that. Thank you so much, Ruth, for your message. Thank you for your book, Transforming Loneliness. I hope our listeners and our Homeward YouTube people watch, not only who are watching, but let me start that again, Mike. Sorry. I hope our listeners and our Homeward YouTube watchers will go out and get that book. And honestly, all things Ruth Graham are in our podcast notes. Go take a look at it. Thanks again so much for taking the time with us. I really appreciate you.
Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, hey, before you leave, I want to speak to you about one aspect of what Ruth talked about. And what I want to talk about is what I'm going to call replenishing relationships. Okay. And I do hope you pick up the book. Before we leave, though, I want to speak to you about this particular subject. And it's so critical for us to understand that we've got to seek replenishing relationships. And we all have what I like to call VDPs. That's very draining people in our life. And we all have VIPs. Maybe when I said VDP, you just all of a sudden thought of like two people. Hopefully it's not the person who, you're the closest to. But we have very draining people. And no doubt a name comes up. Maybe it's somebody who's in your family. It's a coworker. It's somebody that you work with. It's your spouse's best friend. Honestly, it could be your sister-in-law who's an alcoholic who keeps asking for money for you, and that's a VDP. And we're not going to speak to that, but I just simply want to say there's one word. It's called boundaries, and we've talked about it on other podcasts. So we need to have boundaries with VDPs. But I want to talk about VIPs. Okay, and the question I want to ask you is: do you have VIPs in your life who really replenish your relationships? I'll ask men at times. When I was speaking for Promise Keepers, I would ask men, how many of you have a BFF, a best friend forever? And most of the men would say no, they didn't have a best friend. In fact, over 40, if you're age over 40, a lot of men can't name one intimate type relationship. And intimacy, we think about it as sexuality, but intimacy means, deep connection. And so, again, the question we have to ask is, do we lean into replenishing relationships? It doesn't take away all of our loneliness, but it enhances our life in a big way. So there's a proverb. It's not a biblical proverb, but it's a proverb that's run around for a long time. Tell me who your friend is, and I will tell you who you are. And, so I think the friendship part is so important. And Ruth talked about it, and I just wanted to reiterate it. I think we need friendships in at least two areas. One is mentors. Do you have mentors in your life? I wasn't raised in a Christian home. Kathy and I got married, and we just celebrated our 50th anniversary. But boy, at the beginning, we were like, what in the world is going on? We had to find mentors because it wasn't going to come from our parents. Our parents were not horrible people. They just weren't going to be mentors to us. And so you have to find mentors who can coach you and give you wisdom and wise counsel, and you can kind of, imitate them. And I've learned that for me, a lot of things, even dealing with things like loneliness, but I learn from mentors. And so I've got to be around people and spend time with them. I just spent time with one of my mentors. He's about 10 years older than me. His name is Terry. And I had 5 questions to ask him. And over a meal, I asked him these questions. And I mean, he wouldn't call himself a mentor to me, but he's a mentor to me. So he's not mentoring me in his mind, but he is. I've also found mentors in books. Ruth mentored me with Transforming Loneliness. And so there's times that some of our mentors are paper mentors, but we've got to find mentors. The other thing we have to do is find peer support. I have a group of friends. I've talked about it on this podcast. I've met with them for 22 years every Tuesday morning. And I'm a better husband and a better father and a better Christ follower a better president of Homeward because of those men. And at first, we didn't talk honestly about our lives. We were guys. We talked about sports. We talked about some politics. We opened the Bible. We prayed together, but we didn't really do it until one of the guys opened up his kimono and talked about a problem in his marriage, and we all jumped in. And so today we have accountability relationships, things like that. I hope for you that that would be your situation. And, it doesn't have to be a peer group, a peer group like my five of us. It could be one person. It could be somebody that you can be totally honest and blunt and say, as Ruth said, I am lonely, and just do that. The fact is that if you'll have replenishing relationships at whatever stage of life, if you're a young mom and you're super busy right now and it's chaotic, I get it. It's not like you can spend a lot of time, but find somebody. And find somebody, oftentimes at your church is the best place to, go out for coffee. You don't have to open up everything the first moment, but there's some things in your life that they want you to share, and they will share back. And if that doesn't work, then go to the next person, but don't give up on the replenishing relationships. So anyway, just my thought for the day. So grateful that Ruth Graham was with us today. So grateful that we could talk about something as important as transforming loneliness. By the way, the 4 values of Homeward are strong marriages, confident parents, empowered kids, and healthy leaders. And you say, well, how does this fit in? Oh my goodness. When we transform our loneliness from something that's negative to something that can be positive, we're changing our relationships, whether it be within a marriage or if you're single, within your life. If you're a parent, you'll be a better parent. I'm a better parent because I'm around a group of guys, especially, who speak into my life and hold me accountable for things. So anyway, such a great day today. Thanks for listening, watching on the podcast. And if we can be of any help, do not hesitate to go to homeward.com. We love you, and we will connect with you. Many blessings as we go. Thanks again to Ruth Graham. Thanks also to Cindy Ward, Jack Spear, who's in the studio today for the first time, although he built this studio. So I'm so happy to have him today in studio. Thanks to Mike Segovia. I'm Jim Burns. Until next time, God bless.